Lipids play a central role in physiology. When we think of lipids, there's a variety of substances we're going to talk about. They play essential roles in providing energy stores. They are necessary for proper cellular function. Every single cell in our body is dependent on lipids in order to maintain its structure and form. So we're going to cover some introductory concepts regarding lipids, and hopefully this will be a starting point upon which you can then build further with your knowledge regarding this topic. The reason that understanding lipids is so important is that lipids are at the root cause of atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, which is the #1 killer worldwide. So first off, what is a lipid? A lipid is an organic compound, meaning it's comprised primarily of carbon and hydrogen, and it is insoluble in water. So it is lipophilic, it is hydrophobic is another way to state that. There are a variety of lipids in our body. We're going to break these down into 3 major categories. The first is called a triglyceride. And triglycerides are built based on a glycerol backbone, and this is what a glycerol molecule looks like. And at each one of these sites, we can bind a fatty acid. If we bind 1 fatty acid, it's called a monoglyceride, 2 would be a diglyceride, and 3 is a triglyceride. So this is a structure of a triglyceride. When we're looking at these fatty acids that are attached, these can come in different varieties as well. This is an example of a saturated fatty acid. Here we have a monounsaturated fatty acid, and here we have a polyunsaturated fatty acid. Now, related to a triglyceride is the phospholipid molecule, another major lipid within our body. So the phospholipid also is based on this glycerol backbone, but you'll notice here that we just have 2 fatty acids attached, and then on this 3rd carbon, what we're going to see is there's going to be a phosphate moiety attached. Now this phosphate moiety has a binding site which can attach to other organic molecules as well, but this component here makes this a somewhat hydrophilic part of this molecule. So whereas a triglyceride is essentially completely hydrophobic or nonpolar, with this polar attachment of this phosphate moiety, this portion of the molecule is hydrophilic and this portion is hydrophobic. So we call that an amphipathic molecule. The 3rd major lipid that we're going to talk about today is cholesterol. And cholesterol also is an organic compound, has a completely different structure. It involves these ringed structure. And this is what we call free cholesterol. And free cholesterol is a very lipophilic substance, although this little hydroxyl end here does give it a slight amphipathic component in that this is minimally polar. But it's at this hydroxyl site that we can esterify, and what's esterified is typically a fatty acid, and when we do so, that creates what's called a cholesterol ester. And this is going to be very important with regards to cholesterol and how it's handled by the body. So let's now look through what are the different functions of these lipids. And although I mentioned phospholipids initially, we're going to primarily focus today's lecture on triglycerides and cholesterol. So what's the purpose of triglycerides? Triglycerides are the major form of energy storage in our body. Adipose tissue is where we're able to store these triglycerides. Now there's 2 different types of adipose tissue in our body. This is a sagittal section through the body, and the yellow here, of course, is our adipose tissue. So we have our subcutaneous adipose tissue, and this is the adipose tissue which is immediately below our skin. The other component of adipose tissue is called the visceral adipose tissue. So the subcutaneous adipose tissue serves as a long-term energy storage site, whereas the visceral adipose tissue is going to be more metabolically active adipose tissue. So the visceral adipose tissue is going to be that adipose tissue that's surrounding all of our internal organs. Now, if we talk about triglycerides being primarily for energy production, I want to give just a brief review of how and where we get our energy from in our body. So glucose is obviously a very important molecule for our normal functioning and energy production. Our brain is one, and our nervous system that really primarily only wants to use glucose, although all tissues can use it. And when we're looking at getting energy from glucose, there's different ways we can get that. One is through anaerobic glycolysis. So anaerobic glycolysis takes a molecule of glucose, converts it to pyruvate, and then eventually to lactate. Now through this process, a molecule of glucose is able to produce about 2 molecules of ATP per molecule of glucose. When oxygen is present, we then can aerobically metabolize glucose. Once again, glucose will start out being converted to pyruvate, but with oxygen present, it's then going to be shuttled through a different system. It's going to go through the TCA or Krebs cycle, and then from there, the products of the TCA cycle will be sent through oxidative phosphorylation. And what we're going to see is this is going to create a lot more ATP. Now, I mentioned here approximately 32 ATP. These numbers that I use are not meant to be precise numbers. I'm sure that a biochemist may quibble with the numbers that I put here, but as far as giving us just a general concept of the relative amount of ATP, that's the purpose of the numbers that I put here. So under aerobic conditions, we get 32 molecules of ATP from a molecule of glucose. Glucose is stored in the form of glycogen. Glycogen is essentially just a bunch of glucose molecules linked together. And we store glycogen primarily in our liver and in our skeletal muscles. Now, the issue with storing glycogen is we store glycogen in a hydrated form, which means it's associated with molecules of water. So each gram of glycogen is stored with about 3 to 4 grams of water. So that takes up a lot of volume, and that's going to limit the total amount of glycogen storage that we can put away in these two organ systems. Now let's compare that to fatty acids. So fatty acids undergo a process called beta-oxidation. And beta-oxidation essentially takes these long fatty acids and it's going to end up breaking them into 2 carbon units. So fatty acids go through beta-oxidation, that produces these 2 carbon units, and then the 2 carbon units are then going to be shuttled through the TCA cycle, which will then send its products through oxidative phosphorylation. So what we're going to find with this is that roughly for every 2 carbon units that are sent through, we are going to create about 14 molecules of ATP. So if we break a fatty acid down into 2 carbon units, we can figure out roughly how much ATP is going to be created by that fatty acid. So a typical fatty acid that we find in our body is one called oleic acid, and it has 18 carbons in it. So if we use this rough estimate, then 1 fatty acid of oleic acid would create about 126 molecules of ATP. Now realize that a triglyceride has 3 fatty acids attached to it, so a single triglyceride could produce somewhere 375, 400 molecules of ATP. So tremendously more energy is stored in a triglyceride than what we saw with glucose. Now the other important thing about triglycerides is that they are stored in an anhydrous form, meaning they don't need that extra volume of water with it. So this allows a very high density of storage within the adipose tissue.